Hi, I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
Each week, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is a true crime documentary review on Chowchilla. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Shiloh. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. How you doing, Dr. Scott?
Good. I'm good. It is raining.
Yes, it is. Once again.
Except for the leaks in the ceiling. Other than that, yeah.
Oh, well, because you live in a building that's over 100 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
That's part of the charm, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, yeah, we'll deal with that on our end. Before we get started, and kind of as a result of these documentary review episodes that we've done, I call him a friend because we've gotten to know him after a couple of projects, but I wanted to give a big thanks to journalist Nick Thompson over at Vice, because he did an article where he basically interviewed us about what makes an ethical and good true crime documentary. And, it was just kind of a fun thing to do. After he listened to us doing these, he thought it'd be fun to chat about that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
he's a great author too. He has really great ideas, and I'm really excited for some of the other things that he's got sort of scheduled to come out over the next probably year or so. Some really great writing on his part.
Absolutely. So I put a link to that article in the show notes if you guys haven't seen it and wanted to take a look. We're just grateful for the exposure. So yeah, let's do an episode recap and then we can get into our documentary for this month.
Right. So last week we brought you episode 176. It was the Sovereign Citizens episode, but part 2, the psychology and the criminality involved in that mindset, that belief system. So we continue discussing these individuals or groups who adhere to a fringe legal theory, asserting that they are not subject to the authority of government entities. In part 2, we review the research literature and we discuss sovereign citizens' engagement with law enforcement, court systems, and the general public, as well as the impressive mental gymnastics that have moved this once fringe movement into violence.
Yes. So let's get to what we're reading or watching or listening to. What are you doing, Dr. Scott, these days?
Some entertaining stuff. I'm reading. Well, this is not so entertaining, but it is for me. I got the latest edition of Child Psychopathology written by the leading researchers in the area. And it is just like an amazing, I never thought I would be in a place where I'm reading textbooks, for
right.
my side hustle. But it's really, really good. Enjoying that. It's going to take me a long time to get through it. But we're watching Life and Beth, which is Amy Schumer's show on Hulu. It's kind of based on her life story. I know I talked about this before, that she's a bit controversial. There's was rumors about her being difficult to work with. I think anybody in the position of, writing, directing, producing, running their own shows is probably going to be viewed in a challenging manner by some people. I would highly recommend this series. It's funny, but it's also about her journey of being in a relationship with someone that she finds is on the spectrum. And especially in season 2, they really get into it and it's quite poignant. What else am I watching? I just discovered Succession after the show ends.
Oh, right.
I was avoiding it because I thought I would not enjoy watching that level of narcissism. And it's a very well-produced show. It's really mesmerizing. Finished True Detective last night, the last episode. Thought it was one of the best series finales ever. I thought it was just, everything made sense. Everything made sense. So good, so well constructed, amazing acting.
And I was afraid it wasn't going to make sense. I didn't want it to leave me hanging. And I was like, don't do this to me.
I know. I thought it was going to be like season 1, where all of it is a complete mystery of what is a hallucination versus a flashback versus something that's actually happening. And there's just a tiny smidge of that, really. Right. But the crime itself makes a lot more sense. They wrap up a lot of loose ends beautifully. And then I also started watching The Righteous Gemstones, which is hilarious and really funny and actually quite poignant as well. So great writing, great acting. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
What about you?
Well, So, aside from True Detective, which I've been going back and forth texting some of our friends on the thread, especially fellow Twin Peaks fans, where I was like, there is so much parallel. And I did a TikTok about this too, but I was like, maybe I just look through that lens with everything. But it gave me just enough of sort of Twin Peaksy vibes in this season. But yeah, I mean, talk about a woman driven show in a way that just works really, really well. It
Passes
was
the
great.
Bechdel test over and over and over
Yeah.
again. So good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I did go actually out and see a movie, which is just very sporadic for me. I saw American Fiction. I thought it was fantastic. It's one of my favorite films I've seen this year. And then I am finishing up reading Becoming Clerk Rockefeller. So, of course, we had our live stream a couple of weeks ago with Frank Gerardo Jr. And so I'm finishing that book and listening to Media Pressure. So that's Julie Murray's new podcast about Maura Murray. And to hear it from Julie is the freshest new take that I didn't think could be done, especially on this story that's been done so much. And she is talking from the family's perspective. She's also talking to people that have never talked to anyone else in any of their journalistic investigations. So it's really, really lovely to hear the story from Julie. And the podcast is being produced by Sarah Turney's new company. So it's just working. Everything about it is working, which is so great.
That's wonderful. I love hearing that.
Yeah.
So this month we are covering for our documentary episode Chowchilla. It is a very recent documentary produced by CNN back in 2023. You can find currently streaming on Max. And it is billed or described as the strangest mass kidnapping in history. That's a strange flex to use as a descriptor,
Yeah.
but it's not untrue, but I don't know if it's actually accurate. But it does explore a really harrowing event in 1976. And it's told through the voices of those who lived through it and who, I'm careful to use the term survivor, because survivor almost is unfair to describe what happened in the aftermath of the now adult children who went through this experience. You know, they were always here for a survivor driven story, though, and for the impact that an incident can have on our understanding of trauma. And Chowchilla, the documentary, has that in abundance. It has a Rotten Tomato score of 75% for audience. And yeah, we'll give our scores at the end, but just up front, even if there are things you don't like about this documentary, it is a story that needs to be heard.
I feel like we've been saying that lately, which is maybe another prong on a good true crime documentary. Like, it might not be the biggest, it might not be the most engaging, but maybe it's just a story that needs to be heard.
So in 1976, in Chowchilla, California, a group of 3 men kidnapped a school bus full of 26 children along with their bus driver. The men, armed with guns, intercepted the bus, forced the driver and the children into 2 separate vans, and then buried them all alive in a subterranean structure within a quarry.
Yes, which is on the surface, probably the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. And it's so funny because when we decided to do this, I always get this incident mixed up with another one that you've probably heard at trainings, but it's a much more recent incident. It happened in 2013, and it's the Alabama bunker hostage situation. So in that case, a man kidnaps a 5-year-old child, off of a bus and barricades himself in an underground bunker before basically the FBI hostage rescue team comes in and rescues the boy after a very lengthy negotiation process. Maybe we'll cover that one day, but I always, bunkers and buses and kids, these two, I always am like, wait, which one is that one again? So it was nice to really dive into this one.
Yeah, the Alabama bunker case is truly disturbing. And strangely enough, something that I was not aware of, really, it just didn't kind of emerge for me around that time. I don't remember it until just a handful of years ago, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago at an FBI training. They had
Mm-hmm.
members of the team come in and lead us through step by step how it all went down in the investigation. And but then watching that, I mean, I remember I'm over at the VA at that FBI presentation, and they've got these slides. And as these pictures are coming up, I'm just like getting a gut punch because I know that area so well. Everything
Oh,
looked
yeah.
really familiar. It's like that was a really strange experience. But
Yeah, I
let's get
bet.
back to Chowchilla.
Yeah, so you set the scene for us, but before we get into the story, let's of course look at how this documentary is stylized and its production, because we always have some comments with that. But really, we have interviews with the now adult survivors, and this is the driving force behind this documentary. They're really giving their survivor accounts of their memories of this traumatic event, which is also interesting for us to go back and watch
Yeah.
of, how 40, 50 years later, they are interpreting what they experienced. And I don't mean that to say that it's incorrect or anything like that, but it's just fascinating to sit here and watch something like that when, as we'll find out through the story, really hadn't been done to talk to children about traumatic events, and especially mass traumatic events, which thankfully don't happen to children that often, but more so today than ever. So you also have some other folks offering commentary, journalists from the time, a couple of investigators from the case, the retired sheriff. You actually have a parent of one of the children, as well as a child of one of the children from that time, who he is now an adult himself, because again, this has happened so long ago. So those are really interesting perspectives. And then we also get a good amount of time with Dr. Lenore Terr. She's the child psychiatrist speaking on the aspects of trauma. And as we learn, plays a really big role in the aftermath of all of this, which we'll get into. But finally, right, we get at least some more screen time with a mental health professional.
I'm glad you brought up Dr. Terr. I have not been particularly shy about saying this on our show over the past few years that, I've worked with great clinicians. I've worked with mediocre clinicians. I've worked with clinicians that should not be practicing. And that's within our discipline as psychologists. But I've also had the opportunity to work with amazing psychiatrists and other psychiatrists that if I could physically take their license away, I would do it.
Same.
Dr. Terr is like up there. Now I want to know everything about her, because not only is this a medical doctor, clearly highly trained in psychopharmacology, all the medical aspects, but she's also a therapist. She's trained in therapy. She's trained in trauma models. She's not just out there writing prescriptions. Clearly, this is a researcher. Right. This is a person who absolutely said, we have got to figure out what went wrong here so that it never happens again. As far as the follow-up, not the incident itself, but also the long-lasting impact of the event on the children.
Right.
I love the construction of it. Like you were saying, it's stylized. It's almost stylized without any effort, because they have so much footage from the time, like all the news footage from 1976 from the various news programs, the national news, the press conferences. They really, really set the stage for the environment. You're really time traveling in these clips back and forth.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this was such big news. There were press conferences being held that were televised. So we have that. We have the children themselves being interviewed afterwards. There's kind of weaving in some of them at press conferences or public events, but also audio of the police doing their interviews with them about what happened. And I think I was going to mention this later, and I'll pinpoint it better at a better spot. But I like what you said about it sort of transporting you back in a subtle way that works. And it's almost like sometimes you're hearing these adults tell their story of what they experienced, but it's kind of like you're sitting there with the kid. And I don't mean that they like seem childlike or anything like that, but you're kind of like, wait, what time period am I in? You're just really in the moment. And I don't know what the magic formula was for that, but it was done well. Yeah, we also have some reenactments in here that work well and seem to serve a purpose too.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think that the reenactments are some of the best. They're chilling, but they're well done. They're not horror movie, but there's a real sense of unease that is created through them. And then there's also this real poignance. There are some thoughtful moments where you hear now adults commenting on what was going through their minds as children, and you'll see sort of a
Mm.
silhouette of a child sitting in the bunker, and
Yeah.
it works. It really, really works. It is this really interesting combination of listening to the adults talking about their experiences as children, hearing the recordings of the children being interviewed, which is also infuriating for me because of some of the questions that are being asked of the children. I was not very comfortable with a couple of lines of questioning a couple of times, but also the parent, because they're all at an age right now where you're going, wait, who's the parent and who's the child? Like a
Mm.
couple of times I was trying to find, because I'll say this, like everybody was aged by this experience.
Oh, totally.
You know,
Totally.
there is a gravity to these interviewees that is clearly trauma informed. And I think that's important, you know, to remember as we're going through the story. So just to introduce a handful of the characters, and really the main ones that you're coming back to throughout the documentary. Mike Marshall, he's a reserved, clearly very thoughtful cowboy with a hat,
Hmm.
with a very contained, low volume voice, that was the oldest kid on the bus that day at 14 years old. And he's got a very interesting voice. His voice is a little bit high. It's
Hmm.
a little bit thin. It's you know, so it takes a little bit of getting used to, because it's almost like you hear his voice and you almost want to discount him a little
Right.
bit. I don't know,
Right.
just like, you know, with a gut reaction. And then you realize, like, this is actually, we find later that this kid is the reason that everything happened in a good way. You know, if there is good to come out of
Yeah.
this, I mean, this kid is really like the linchpin. Then we also have Jeff Brown, and he's an adult pastor and spiritual counselor. He was only 8 years old on the bus that day with his sister. We have Linda Correjo, a still beautifully smiling, cherub faced woman with long dark hair. And I think she also was 7 or 8 years old
Yeah.
when she was part of the kidnapping. And we also have Jennifer Hyde, and she's, you know, she looks like your typical soccer mom who
Hmm.
had the experience with her own brother. She's
Yeah.
not Jeff's sister, though. And she, I think, was 9 years old. All these kids are within just a few years of each other, except for Mike, who was the oldest at 14.
There are a couple really young ones that were like 5 because this was summer school. And so it was like everyone who's in summer school is getting on the bus. But it's funny as you hear the girls interviewed or the women now interviewed kind of talking about Mike back then, they're like, he was like the really good looking older boy. And he was, I mean, he was such a cutie. And
Yeah.
it's interesting when you go back and listen to the audio tapes when he's being interviewed, he still has that same voice. So it's like, oh, okay, I think it a little bit at the beginning of the documentary, you're almost led to believe that he kind of speaks this way as a result of the trauma, but he's always had that voice.
Yeah. That's a very good point. You were wondering, like, did something, anyway, I don't want to get too far into
Yeah.
that because it sounds judgy or like we're trying to read something into it. Mike is a hero. I'm
Yep.
just going to say that.
Yep.
I'm going to say that throughout all of this. And while these individuals are the primary voices in the documentary, additional profiles are shared along with just a huge amount of photos of the children in their home environments, as well as during the aftermath of the rescue. So we're introduced to them in the doc, and this lays the foundation for Chowchilla being, you know, this major farming and cattle community here in Central California. Central California, I don't think gets as much sort of recognition by the country as for actually how important it is to the entire United States. It is a huge agricultural and cattle center. I mean, it is so much food is produced in the Central
Yep.
California area. And there are tons of these little communities that are adjacent to these large farms. Back in 1976, it was a place to be known where crime was low. Everybody knew everybody. All the people knew who their kids were, whose kids belonged to who. And it's a super safe environment. And even the interviewees comment on this sense of safety that they had throughout their childhoods up until this point. So it's
Right.
clear at the time that the crime took place, Chowchilla was just this example of a relatively, like what we call now free range parenting, kind of what I grew up with, taking place in the 70s. So on July 15th, 1976, was when everything started to go down. It took place during summer school activities. And interestingly, these summer school activities were so popular that the children themselves engaged in putting together a petition for it to be extended by 2 weeks. So you get a sense that it's like summer school, but it's also like almost like a summer day camp.
Yeah.
You know, they're just organized. They all get to hang out with their friends. There's things to do every day. It's really great. And they had, because it wasn't during the school year, they have a rotating bus driver schedule. And on this day was Ed Ray. He was the fill in bus driver on this date, and he was a farmer himself. So at approximately 4 p.m., the school bus carrying 26 Dairyland Elementary School students was driven by Ray, and it's hijacked by three armed men in Chowchilla. The children, aged 5 to 14, and the driver are abducted. Jeff Brown, now a pastor and a religious counselor, recounts that he didn't have his medication on that day, which added to his restlessness and his shifting from bus seat to bus seat. And he shares that the closeness with another student who was a female was a very calming factor on him. And they were very good friends. And she just sort of took this slightly parental or sibling like role with him to get him to sit down and focus. And Jeff is really clearly an individual who's very, very rooted in his religious beliefs. And he frames much of the entire incident and his life afterwards through a faith lens response.
Which makes sense
So
later when we find out he's a pastor now.
absolutely, absolutely. So they're driving down the road and the bus has to stop because there's a white van blocking the road. As soon as the bus stops, several men disguised with masks made of nylon hose surround the bus with weapons, banging on the door and forcing all the children to the back, fully pointing shotguns at the children's faces.
Yeah.
Really, really frightening. And the adults now recount their versions of how this went down and how frightened they were and how terrifying the masks were, the pantyhose, which kind of distorted their features, making them look like monsters, basically.
Yeah.
So the kidnappers drive the bus to California Rock and Gravel Quarry in Livermore, California, where they imprison the victims in a buried truck trailer turned into an underground bunker. So the kids, now adults, recount thinking of anything that they can do to intervene once they're put in. But as they're being pulled away, there are several people that are recounting, I've seen enough TV shows to know that this is serious. So as they're piled into vans, they notice that the vans are lined with plywood and likely some kind of padding or soundproofing under the plywood and against the wall of the van. Ed Ray, the bus driver, is removed first. They're driven, by the way, for almost 6 hours. So a lot of driving around in circles, likely so that they disorient the kids and feel like they're being taken a long way away.
Right.
One of the children interviewed describes being pulled into a tent or a tarp construction that the vans were backed into. And one by one, the van doors open and close, and the children are taken again one by one into this tent structure surrounded by the three gunmen where their names and ages were confirmed. And then they are told to climb down a ladder into another structure and then into a manhole deep within this quarry.
Terrifying.
Really, really screwed up. So one by one, they're going down. And Jody Hethington is a 10-year-old female, and she's remembered throughout this entire documentary as being very much an immediate caregiver to all the kids. She is just taking control of the situation. She's calming the other kids down. You know, she's trying at her best to organize this really terrifying situation. The kids get down into the tent structure. They get the manhole. They go all down. As they each land at the bottom, they find themselves crowded into a long, narrow structure. And after being in the vans for hours, they have had no food, no water. They've not been able to use the bathroom. They now see that there's some food and water, as well as a stack of dirty mattresses and a makeshift toilet. Once they're all in the structure, the manhole cover drops, and they remember hearing objects being dropped on top of the manhole cover, as well as dirt shifting.
Like everyone's worst nightmare, right? Like literally being buried
Horrible.
alive, hearing
Horrible.
the dirt covering you. Just, I can't imagine something more traumatic. So at 4:30 that afternoon, the first parent calls dispatch at the police station to report that the bus has not dropped their kids off. And, this was summer session. So it's an alternative route that's taken. It's a little willy nilly, right? It's not very structured and regimented, like probably on a day where they have to deal with hundreds of kids. And you now have some through footage and some through interviews today, parents kind of sharing the worry that was happening, where not trying to worry too much at the beginning, but then they're starting to put the stories together. And now, really, the whole town is starting to show up at the police department and see how they can help. So, this part is also then interspersed with, of course, some audio recordings of the children that are interviewed afterwards. One of those quotes from the child said, "I felt like an animal being led to slaughter." And these are kids from a farming and cattle community. Like they know what that means. That's a very accurate way to explain what they were feeling. And then we get a little taste of Dr. Tear. We get the mental health professional in here, child psychiatrist, just offering how incredibly terrifying this could be to a child, especially a child from this community where safety was really foundational to their childhoods and to the community at large. And this is the point I was like, oh, good. I hope we get to hear more from her. And thankfully we do. But, it's all points bulletin on this bus. Everyone is out looking for it. They get some pilots up. I think probably some of the pilots that do some of the work that help with the farming out there, get them up in the air. And finally, they find the empty bus dumped off in a ditch, but it's empty. And now the entire state is on high alert. And governor at that time, one of the times he was our governor, Jerry Brown, his office is basically putting the entire state on alert for just how they portray. I mean, obviously we know this, but through the news accounts and press conferences that they're showing, just an unbelievable situation that 26 kids and a bus driver have up and vanished.
Right. The response is pretty amazing. Like every local police department, sheriff's agency throughout the state, they're just everybody is descending on this town, and which is necessary because there's now a lot of reporters coming as well. This is a small town with not that much of an infrastructure, so they do need help, corralling and directing people there. So the structure of the documentary goes back and forth about what is happening on this timeline. So they're giving you 10 hours in, 12 hours, 18 hours, 20, and which actually adds for me to the tension because you're just thinking those kids are underground. So we're flipping back and forth. And now we're seeing back in the bunker, the children are discovering that, it's really hard to breathe, despite the fact that there is movement of air, and they're able to look through a hole and see that it is connected to some sort of fan, at least like 25 feet away or something like that. Mm-hmm. And the fan is moving slowly and it's pumping some, sort of dry, warm air, not particularly fresh by any means, but at least there is air coming out. But they do know that eventually whatever was running those fans, the power gives out. So now some of the adults are sharing that as children, they start having very strange experiences, that they're clearly having some sort of hallucinations. Dr. Tear jumps in and offers, that fear can cause hallucinations, which is true. I don't know the research on that, and I actually have been diving in trying to look for it. I also want to offer that, like, maybe the lack of oxygen could be contributing to it. There's also just dissociation. When you dissociate, your brain doesn't necessarily hallucinate, but it does sort of go into an altered state. Either way, whatever was driving these things, again, these children are being absolutely, absolutely traumatized. Now we're at a point where they notice that the support beams within the structure that are holding up the roof of this are starting to buckle. So there's dirt that's shifting through one of the metal plates of the roof. There's creaking in the 2x4s that have been used to create this structure within the structure. And all the kids realize, like, this is a problem. This is really going badly.
This is where I think the reenactments really help give visuals to this. Because in your mind, you can think, okay, bunker, what does that mean? But you see these sort of shoddy 2x4s holding up a roof structure that we know now is several feet deep, covered in dirt. And I mean, these kiddos know it, and you're just putting yourself in their shoes of being there, not knowing if it's going to hold, and if they're all just going to be smothered to death.
So one of the things that comes up too is that they're not being unkind. I think they're just being plain in the way they state this, is that Ed Ray is pretty much frozen in fear.
Yeah.
Like, he goes through sort of these periods where he's trying to be comforting to the children. But at one point, he is sort of inspired by Mike, the 14-year-old, to just start searching. Yeah. So they are covering, they've got a flashlight that they were given, and they are covering every square inch of this structure from the inside, trying to figure out if there's anything that they can work with. And Mike is quoted at one point. He says, I was trying to process it all. If we're going to die, then we're going to die trying to get out. Mm-hmm. And somebody recounts, one of the other interviewees says he was my angel. Like, he described Mike as like this sort of practical but steely young man who was just gonna, he's not even a young man, he's a boy, but he's gonna take some very adult responsibilities. So they get their resources together and they figure, what can we do? And all of these plans are broken up by at least 2 episodes where Ed Ray gets the kids to start chanting, "Pretty please don't hurt us. Pretty please don't hurt us," which is very odd. And I don't really know what to do with it. It's a very like childlike response. If I was going to give him credit for being super creative, was he trying to remind the kidnappers that there are children in here and this is the way they're talking? It was very, I had a weird reaction to it.
As they dig their way out, they don't know if the kidnappers are on the other side or if there's nobody there, right? So it's like, as they sort of start to make some movement, he has the kids saying this. It could have been a distraction technique. They certainly don't paint it like that, but it sounds very pleading. I don't know. I think Ed just didn't know what to do with this. I mean,
I think he did. Right.
How would you like to be the only adult trying to figure out what's going on?
I wouldn't. Yeah, no. Like, this is definitely armchair quarterbacking here. So, bear with me as I try and figure this out. But what does happen is they look around and see the only things that they have to work with are the mattresses. So they stack the mattresses up. Ed is able to stand up against the manhole cover. And he pushes and pushes and pushes, can't get through it. Mike joins him eventually, and they are able to finally get a little bit of movement. And in the middle of it, Mike actually has a hallucination and he is overwhelmed by hopelessness. But then as panic is setting in and the kids are starting to feel short of breath, Ray encourages them to have a nap to calm things down. And then he and Mike begin to come up with this plan. So as they're pushing on that cover, it's not working, but you just realize that they're not going to give up. And Mike really is the driving force about them not giving up. Yeah.
So Mike's up there on top of the mattress with Ed Ray. Them together can get this manhole cover up just enough for Mike to stick his skinny little arm through. And, they make a point to talk about how incredibly heavy it was and not knowing why. And that if any of them, lose a grip, you see these mattresses stacked on top of each other. You're like, oh my God, if these slip out from underneath them, Mike's arm is just going to be lopped off in a second. So
it's very scary.
So tense. And Mike is feeling around and finally is able to grab something that's sitting on top of the manhole cover, because there's like a cleared space in there where the manhole cover is. It's not dirt directly on top of that. It's like a little box. And he's able to find that these are batteries from the buses, right? Or from
they're
some
like
sort of vehicle
they're battery.
batteries.
Yeah, no, they're batteries that are used for school buses, and they're like 150 pounds a piece. That's really,
Yeah.
really heavy.
So one by one, slowly by, inch by inch, he's able to sort of scoot these off of the manhole cover. And, you just think of like a 14-year-old boy with his little arm doing this and how long that must have taken. But then he's able to get up sort of in this little box now, crouched down, and is able to see that he can just start moving some dirt away little by little after he pounds through the plywood of the box of what it's, the structure is sort of made out of. And again, like, I think this is another part where he kind of is having some hallucinations, but think about how dehydrated these kids are, the heat.
Yeah.
Like, it's just so, so remarkable, the strength and the resilience that these kids showed through all of this. But he is able to, I think, does another kid get up there with him, or is it Ed Ray? Because
No,
two of
I
them,
think he's in the structure because it's very small, the structure above the manhole. Then there,
yeah,
like you said, there's walls of plywood, and he gets he finds a 2x4 or a piece of wood that he can use to scrape. He's also a very smart kid because he's really like, we're underground. Like, he doesn't say this outright, but you can tell he's being careful because he doesn't know if the walls that he's digging at are going to collapse in.
right,
So he's
right.
very carefully scraping dirt. And then they start this sort of, river of dirt coming down into the structure through the manhole. And the kids are all pushing it away. Like
Right.
they're all kind of working together now. And
Yes.
it breaks through and he sees sunlight, after a
Yes.
very short time of getting the dirt out of the way.
Yeah, he sees sunlight. He's able to clear enough of a path where they can all one by one now start getting out, and essentially the children rescue themselves. They all climb out. They realize they're in a wide open space, but they see some structures and it's a rock quarry, and they kind of are stumbling out into the daylight. And then a guard from the rock quarry sees them coming out and is like, I know who these kids are. These are the missing 26 kids. And they are, I don't want to say they're rescued. They're not rescued. They rescue themselves, but they escape. And then, of course, the authorities are called in.
Kind of amazing also that the guard knew immediately who they were, because that talks about like the amount of news coverage at that time, 1976. There's no internet, but like it's all over the radio, it's all over the news.
Right.
And by the way, there was worldwide news coverage at the time, and there were all sorts of crazy theories. There were people calling in saying that this was like the height of satanic panic.
Oh, totally.
So
yeah.
They were saying it was Satanists, it was Moonies, it was an alien abduction, it was Son of Sam. Everything was being considered. And all the while, this, limited police force in Chowchilla was having to sift through all of these calls, which is very important later on. All the phone lines were tied up.
Yes, exactly. And I think probably the most poignant part of this documentary, once the authorities get there and are basically taking inventory of the kids, they snap a Polaroid of each of the children, right? And so in the documentary, they put the Polaroid up and then they put up a picture next to it of the child as an adult for most of them. But we see these pictures of these kids who have just spent all of these hours in a bunker, not knowing if they were going to live or die. And half of them have these adorable smiles on their face because their picture's being taken. Some of them just look so tired. Some of their eyes are just so sad. It's just a whole range of emotions from kids. And it's just so sweet. But then you're looking in their eyes and you're like, what is life going to be like for them after this? So the victims are taken to St. Rita jail for medical treatment. I mean, that's kind of the closest facility that they thought, they could start at least getting them fed, kind of put them all in one place where they'd be safe. And they undergo a debriefing by Alameda County Sheriff so they can start the investigation and get some leads directly from the children who saw the offenders firsthand. And then the FBI kind of simultaneously starts looking into the son of the quarry owner. And the quarry owner was Frederick Newhall Woods. And some associates of the son, who was also a Fred Woods, named James and Richard Schoenfeld, and they were brothers. The news starts to get out that the kids are okay, they're all safe. The parents are starting to hear this. And meanwhile, the parents have to wait until some of the logistics are done and the interviews. So these kids, and there's footage of all of this, are given basically jail food, an apple, and I forget what else they said that they gave them. Oh, some milk. Yeah, the little milk cartons. They're given inmate coveralls to wear. So they're basically in these jail jumpsuits made out of paper that are so long for an adult, and they're just wandering around in these big old balloon suits. It's really cute and sad at the same time. And then they put them on a Greyhound bus to be transported back to Chowchilla once they're done to meet their parents, which, I'm sure you and I and a lot of people are thinking, okay, this is completely activating to the trauma that they just
had. Completely. Why would you put them on a bus? There are so many other options. 26 kids, get 5 big cars.
Yeah.
Like they're just, but that's just the beginning of things that were not thought out in the aftermath of this.
So, in these interviews, the kids are telling the story of what happened, but also they're children. They don't know what's important to say. They're not going to toot their own horn. And really, through a series of what is talked about with the authorities, Ed Ray is given all of the credit for them escaping. And yes, I mean, he certainly had a part in it, and he was the adult there, which is why I think all the other adults just kind of assumed that story as well. But even Mike talks about, like, I didn't really speak up for myself. I was just happy to be alive, when Mike truly is the hero, the one that made this all happen.
This 14-year-old boy is the hero of the story, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the investigation goes on. They essentially start following the leads that link the vans used in the crime back to, really, it takes them to a facility where they find other things that are totally linked to the crime. They find shotgun parts. They find mattresses that match the mattresses that were in the bunker and in the vans. The same lumber is the ones back at the bunker. And then it's either the purchase or the rental of some of the vehicles used in this crime that come back to the Woods family. And the Woods family is an incredibly wealthy family from the Bay Area. So as viewers, and then it kind of mimics this, the investigators are like, why are they going to be involved in a crime like this? Like, what? But, it's like one stupid step in a crime after another. Like, you're going to do the bunker, like bury this bunker on your family's rock quarry property. It's like one thing that it's like, all right, this
for as well thought out as it was, it's amazing.
They thought it was well thought out.
They thought that they had really watched every movie that they needed to watch in order to make this happen, right?
Yeah. So this unravels really quickly. The law enforcement that's investigating this crime, they get a search warrant. They basically go to the Woods family compound and mansion with a search warrant. And this place is just surrounded by junk cars, multiple garages.
It looks like hundreds. It really looks like hundreds of cars.
Yeah. And like totally inoperable junk. It's really like almost a hoarding situation, which is very odd.
We'll come back to that.
Definitively, it is. So there, the cops find an entire layout of the plan. All of, when they took down the kids' info, when they were putting them into the hole of the bunker, they found all of that written on the back of a Jack in the Box carton, and ransom notes found for different amounts. But I think the highest one, they were asking for $5 million. You have a journal with all of these like coded writings, just bizarre, like very movie-like for a stash house that is at your family's mansion. Like, if you're going to do this off site, okay, cool, have all your stuff there. But Jesus, this was just not the smartest plan ever.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. I actually am going to retract a little bit. I don't think that it was quite at the level of hoarding, but what it was somebody that, as in addition to a number of other things going on diagnostically, clearly had ADHD. Like when they show the camera going through the garage apartment where he lived, the place was just completely in disarray. This was clearly somebody that, you know, could do part of a task and then had to move on to something else and would like forget things, which is also really kind of illustrates not only all of the cars, you know, I'm going to get to it. I'm going to get to it. I'm going to do that project. I'm going to do that project. And then what we find out happens to him later on, what he's been doing while he's in prison.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So Schoenfeld voluntarily surrenders to authorities, and that is followed by the arrest of his brother, James Schoenfeld, in Menlo Park later the same day. Their associate, Fred Woods, is apprehended by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Vancouver, British Columbia, after multiple attempts to go across the border. And if it wasn't so horrifying what happens to these kids, it would be funny that this dumbass keeps trying to drive across the border with all these weapons in his car. And the Canadians are so polite, they like, you know, give him a donut and some coffee and kind of turn him around and send him on his way. And he comes back.
No, you can't do that.
You know? Yeah, they like keep finding guns that are in his car that he's not aware are in there.
And he's so wealthy. Like, if anyone's going to escape the country, it's going to be this guy, but nope.
Right. And also, why do it by car? You know, there's so many other ways. I mean, again, clearly I'm not in the same cognitive space that he was. So now we're moving to the part of the documentary where there's tons of news footage about the suspects going in and out of court. They're, for the time, have good hygiene, relatively well dressed, and they're all described as, you know, they're all very polite and outgoing, very friendly boys. And there are several scenes where they're laughing with their attorneys. Again, as we've said in many episodes before, you can't always read into a complete profile of a person just by one or two or three or more captured moments by the media. I get that. However, there were several times that the guys were clearly smirking amongst themselves. Like there was a real entitled attitude about the way these guys carried themselves. Is disturbing, to the point where it's infuriating the community so much that they have to post snipers on the top of the buildings in order to protect the defendants coming in the court, because there have been so many death threats. And then they're also just the dumbassery. I mean, again, this is looking through a current lens back many, many years ago, before we understood the impact on children. And they are interviewing the kids and asking them completely inappropriate questions for what's going on. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Well, what do you think should happen? You know, again, just putting this ridiculous pressure on the kids.
As these kids, by the way, are having to prepare to go and testify in front of these assholes. Awful.
Yeah, in the room. Yeah, it's horrible, just horrible. You find out later that those movies that he was inspired by include Dirty Harry, The French Connection, as well as a couple of others, like sort of like high, like testosterone films for the times, with like catchphrases and sort of this almost Fast and Furious view of how police work and crimes would happen, which is not realistic at all. What we find out is that they researched this crime and planned it for over a year and a half, obtaining multiple weapons. But at the end, they couldn't get through to the police station to make the ransom calls because all of the phone lines were tied up with everyone trying to get into Chowchilla to cover this. After a lengthy trial, and one of the defenses being that there was no bodily injury done to the children, because that's all existed was bodily injury, they were able to make a case that emotional and mental health issues were a part of it, but it was pretty tenuous. But despite it being tenuous, all three perpetrators finally pled guilty to kidnapping for ransom and robbery, but they did refuse to plead guilty to infliction of bodily harm. So they're initially sentenced to life without parole, but an appellate court overturns the bodily harm finding, leading to resentencing to life with the possibility of parole.
Yeah. So again, like going back to these brave kiddos, having to testify in court. I mean, it's just maddening to watch and listen to them have to relive that, as they're talking about it now as adults as well. There's like all of these stages of reliving this. And this is the point where I really thought, it's so interesting to listen to them talk about these things where you feel like they're recounting the incidents and it's almost like you are hearing it from a child, like you're there alongside them, transported back there with them. And I think that was really done in a non-exploitative way. I mean, I didn't feel that way at all. I feel like the four like really, strong voices of the main people interviewed here seemed like they wanted to tell their story, again, a story that needed to be heard, and with their direction and their input in there, because it's about the incident, but it's also about the aftermath and just like,
Right.
what can we do better to serve kids?
So one of the things that we don't know about this documentary is we don't know how many people were initially interviewed, and it may have been winnowed down to these
True.
four voices. Maybe they were the most cohesive ones. Maybe they had way too much that they couldn't get in. Or it's also possible that some of the adults were like, I've already lived this for 40 plus years. I can't live it again. I mean, that's very much a possibility. So, whoever took part in this, I applaud your resilience and your bravery. So as a follow-up to what happens to the children after the arrest, even before the trial happens, is that politicians move to have a parade and a celebration day. Not the greatest decision for continued pressure. It really was not thought out well at all. Mike, this quiet young man, is overwhelmed. And he shares that he's bombarded with all of these feelings. He feels guilty, but he feels guilty for feeling bad when they got rescued.
Mm-hmm.
And he's even able to say now, we were just trying to process what happened. And a lot of us were still in that hole. Now, what they point out is that the kids are now having to have pretty significant symptoms. They're having nightmares, episodes of sleepwalking, constant hypervigilance, belief that they're being followed. They're questioning one woman interviewed says every time she saw a van in the road, she's like, don't stop. You got to keep driving, get past that van. One woman recounts that she has nightmares that she's being killed over and over and over again. So again, some of the common trauma responses, replaying the event, nightmares, sleepwalking, dissociation, all of this is happening to these children. And then one of the parents notes the school didn't offer any support. Nothing. They didn't offer anything they didn't offer any counseling. They were just sort of forgotten, except with, what do you do that's going to just fix everything? You organize a trip to Disneyland. Yeah, it's just so they think that they're going to dump all these kids down and like, well, this will be the thing that kind of gets them back on track. And I do understand at the time there was a very, very limited understanding of what was going on. I myself had a traumatic, really, really traumatic event happen to me when I was a senior in college in Alabama, just a few years after this event, really. And it was absolutely traumatizing. It affected my entire family. It affected so many people in my circle, and my school did nothing. There was no outreach. There was no one in administration that came by and said, hey, are you okay? What adjustments can we make for you?
Yeah.
It just wasn't part of our culture at the time. And it should have
been. Okay, hang on. Wait, do I want to say what year this was? In the early 90s, when I was in 8th grade, and we took our annual 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C., the second we left Ontario Airport and got into the air, one of our engines exploded, and we had to do an emergency landing. And I thought I was going to die with everyone in 8th grade, and I desperately did not want that to happen. And they put us on a bus and took us over to LAX, and off we went on a flight to Washington, D.C. Like nothing. People were calling their parents. I was like, I'm not going to call my mom because she will come get me. So I was like, no, I'm going to Washington, D.C. But literally none of that. We just went on our trip like nothing had happened. We all just thought we were going to die together. So
how about that? Those Disneyland pictures were pretty.
I know. Could we talk about like the Cinderella, the 70s Cinderella with the
It was
feathered
like
hair?
it looked like Farrah Fawcett with her with Cinderella's tiara.
I was like,
Like they were,
what?
yeah,
Disney would
that
never
was
do that
crazy.
now.
But another thing that was really, really messed up that some of the doctors and mental health clinicians did, and this is not the psychiatrist that we really,
Mm-mm.
really love, but the parent was told that's being interviewed is they were told not to reward the nighttime behaviors.
Oh my
Like,
God.
don't, if your child is crying, don't go into the room. You're just rewarding it, which it's just
What?
hard to wrap your mind around as a clinician today that would be your assumption even at that time. That's pretty basic. That's not
It
rewarding a
is.
behavior. You're comforting a traumatized kid.
Yeah. So this is where they do have Dr. Lenore Terr talk a little bit more, and she recounts how I guess they had originally sent another child psychiatrist out there that said, "Oh, 1 in 25 of these kids will have a problem. Like, they'll bounce back." And there's even footage of the principal that's like, "Well, I don't see anything wrong with them. I mean, there might be something going on the inside, but I'm no doctor." It's like, okay, great. That's awesome. And she says by the time she was contacted and alerted to the situation and seeing it as a way to serve these children, but also a way to serve child psychiatry and gets involved, she said 100% of them were having problems. Every single one of them had something going on that was textbook trauma response. So I want to talk, this became the Chowchilla study, what she did. And I just want to talk a little bit, just do an overview of what this was, because they don't really talk about the ins and outs of the study. They can't dedicate the time to that. But Dr. Terr came in and she conducted interviews with 23 of the 25 children and one or both of their parents over an 8-month period. And it's interesting because as a medical doctor, but also a psychiatrist, Dr. Terr's primary approach was actually psychoanalytic. So, like you were saying earlier, she's a therapist as well as, this medical doctor, this psychiatrist. And she conducted intensive interviews with the children and their parents, exploring a lot of new concepts. Dr. Terr also, as a part of her psychoanalytic approach, did some examination of their dreams. And she concluded that some of their dreams where they were being killed again or being shot really was the underpinning of their trauma from this situation being played out in what we call reliving the experience. Now, that can be when you're awake and conscious, where you're thinking about it over and over again, or it can certainly be when you're asleep through nightmares. And like previous researchers, Dr. Terr observed regressive behaviors and developmental delays in the children, including bladder control difficulties, so some physiological issues. And all of the children experienced deep separation anxiety, visual and auditory hallucinations, and misperceptions during and after the event. So she really went back to question what was going on during the event and some of these quote unquote like hallucinations that were coming up. Dr. Terr noted that the kidnapped Chowchilla children experienced profound psychological trauma. She introduced the concept of omen formation, suggesting that as a defense mechanism, the ego tries to regain control by interpreting past events as omens that could have prevented the trauma. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. Kids
Oh
trying
yeah.
to make sense of something that they shouldn't even have to deal with. And with such biologically underdeveloped brain, how else are you going to make sense of this? I mean, there's so many different ways.
Right. It's a way of comforting myself to say, well, this was trying to alert me that this was going to happen. If I had paid attention to it,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have happened. So I'm going to be super hyper vigilant about this particular thing now so that it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, exactly. So she was saying that this process allows the ego to reconstruct events in a way that avoids or mitigates the trauma, either that they're feeling in the moment or any future potential trauma. Dr. Terr observed that during or after the traumatic event, the ego displays of dysfunction by developing an immediate fear of further trauma and trying to account for that. So, I mean, that's something we all know very well now. But really, up until then, no one had really studied this in children, and there hadn't been that many situations where multiple children had gone through the same event. So that's what's really special about this. You can have a child go through one particular event, but to look at one situation through the lens of 23 kids is a really interesting sample to take away some robust research. So Dr. Ter's significant contribution was distinguishing between symptoms exclusive to children and then those previously thought to be characteristic of adult reactions, but not seen in children. The children did not exhibit repression, amnesia, memory lapses, emotional numbing, or altered consciousness, which are typically adult symptoms. Additionally, they did not employ the primitive defense mechanism of denial, which is typical in extreme stress situations for both children and adults. Again, I hypothesize that has to do with the fact that this was all a shared experience. So, you can't deny something necessarily that someone else was there with you to experience. So instead, the children displayed age-specific symptoms such as unconscious anxiety expressed through play, behavioral reenactments, and repetitive dreams, and some experienced changes in cognitive function, while others developed lasting personality changes as a result of this incident. So it's interesting to go back. There's a lot of papers about even, 4 years later at different increments, her research team would try to go back and touch base with them. And it seems as if we hear from some of the folks in this documentary that they're really grateful for the work that she did. And, even if they can pay it forward and it contributed to the field, she was somebody that they trusted.
Which it clearly has, because before that time, we just didn't see children as having trauma. Part of it, I think, also is this denigration and view of children as not fully human. At times, they're like these cute little things. And yes, I'm supposed to protect them. And I've got this responsibility as a parent. But parents get to the point where I think they can actually go into denial, where when something so horrific happens and they feel like they somehow usurped or they relinquish their parental responsibilities for keeping their children safe, they can't sit with that. So they have to deny it. And there can't be anything wrong with my kid. I think that I don't think that. I know that still happens today. Yeah. Because I deal with it when I'm educating families. But I can only imagine with the lack of resources and understanding at that time that it made it a lot worse.
And the parents went through their own trauma. I mean, not knowing who your kids are for 26 hours, like some of that footage is just heartbreaking of, them sticking cameras and microphones in parents' faces of like, well, what are you thinking now? Yeah, they had their own parallel trauma.
Yeah. So over the years, Woods is repeatedly denied parole, as are the other defendants. But in August 2022, at the age of 70, Richard Schoenfeld is paroled in 2012 and James Schoenfeld is paroled in 2015. Multiple parole hearings had happened, though, over the years throughout the mid 80s when one of the sentences was overturned. And the survivors it is their life duty to keep going, to keep going, to keep going. They know that they are driven to do this to keep these guys off the streets. But clearly, many times they are being traumatized by the experience themselves, having to go in every few years and stare those guys in the face. And I was also taken aback by the fact that despite the enormity of this crime and the number of victims of this crime, they were at the most low-level prison in the state of California. They were at CMC, which is literally, I think 3/4 of a mile from the ocean. It's known as the Riviera of Department of Corrections. Very low fences. It's, very low danger. I mean, a prison should not be a place where people are endangered. I will go on record saying that. But it really was surprising that they were allowed to be in this particular facility. Jeff Brown, who is the pastor, goes through the restorative justice process. And as a really intense person of faith, he chooses to forgive them and then goes so far as to ask them to forgive him for hating them.
Yeah.
And I am very respectful of his process. If I was counseling him, if I was counseling someone going through that process, I think that I would lean heavily in another avenue with that latter part of the process.
Yeah. So the restorative justice process is interesting. It actually has to start on the inmate side where they go through a huge process to essentially be reunited and have a face-to-face meeting with their victim. And then the victim agrees to do that, right, for their own journey through healing. So I think it was one of the Schoenfeld brothers that did that process that he and that Jeff Brown ended up meeting with, which takes a lot of work on the offender side, the convict side. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear him, clearly again through, kind of a religious spiritual lens, say what it meant to him and what he had
Yeah.
harbored for all of these years. And it felt like a release. Like he was almost saying, can I have your forgiveness for me carrying around this for as long as I did? It was interesting. I'm really glad they included that piece because we don't hear about
I
that
am
very
too.
often.
Despite my reactions to it, I think it's very important. But it's also not about what my observations are. It's about whatever Jeff needs to do to take care of himself.
Totally. Yeah.
And I hope that process brought him the relief that he needed. Jody is one that you're following through this documentary. And because she's such a powerful and important inflection point within this documentary, but you're not hearing her interviewed, already kind of gives you this foreboding to know that she's probably something's gone wrong. Either she's not alive or she chose not to participate. And as it turns out, she died at the age of 55 after years of depression and maybe some self-medication with alcohol. It's implied, but it's not distinctly set out. But who picks up the banner is her wonderful son, who, just really, you could tell had great, great love for his mother and believed in her cause and believed in her. But she was someone that she was carrying the weight of this trauma year after year after year. And she, as I was saying earlier, was the 10-year-old girl who took on the mother role to all these other kids, trying to keep them calm and organized and distracted from this horrible event of being buried underground.
Terry and Linda would go to these parole hearings like every year together, no matter what. Like some other people would go as well, but they always made the trek, especially when it was always in person. And so Linda's kind of telling Jody's story as well. And she recalls that when they finally get paroled, that Jody was saying, like, it's my fault. I couldn't keep them in. Like, it's all of our jobs to just keep them in and testify at these parole hearings. And I just thought, you shouldn't have that burden. Like, respectfully, it seemed like it was her mission, but those survivors should have never felt like that was their burden to keep them in.
Absolutely not. I mean, that's where I think something. So Dr. Tare is doing her job along with her colleagues to check in with these individuals every few years, but it's not enough. And I don't know what was going on that end. I don't know if she was strongly encouraging people to get into treatment. We don't know, but trauma affects people differently, and I think that the burden for this woman was a lot. And I agree with you. Like the idea that her being stuck in that place of that it was her job, that's just overwhelming. That's taking on a responsibility that is not yours. An infuriating aspect that is revealed is that Woods is noted to have been working multiple businesses from prison. He buys.
You're not allowed to do.
You're not allowed to do. And also just laying it out, phone calls from prison are monitored. So somebody was getting paid off. Whoever was in charge of monitoring those calls was clearly burying the information, because that's just not allowed. You're not allowed to do that, especially the length and depth of what he was doing that went on for year after year after year. And he does like completely antisocial things in this as well. And one of the biggest ones was having associates on the outside purchase the vans that they had used to kidnap the children from the bus, because he thought that they would be worth increased value for like crime aficionados or something. So that's really antisocial, really, really antisocial. And then on top of it, why does he even need the money? The guy literally has a family trust of over $100 million.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly something else driving him. And They do have a very small snippet. I totally acknowledge that this is not everything, but a very small snippet of him speaking at his parole hearing. And they do not sound like a person who has had a notable change in his cognitive distortions. It's
Not
like
at
he's
all.
trying, he goes, I've had a thinking change about why I need money. I'm like, I'm sorry. that is not good enough to say you've had a thinking change. Like, please articulate why you are not going to be doing wild and crazy things to just keep chasing money, which seems like what this whole thing was about, because he didn't need it.
So I wanted to go back to something you said earlier too. You were being very nice about Jody's case. You said with all due respect, and I don't think you have to be respectful at all because it's so infuriating. One of the things that they bring up is that one of the main investigators, this big burly, sort of probably bloviating public figure, told the kids, we're never going to let them out. And he's going to be, protecting those kids. And he later shifts and becomes an advocate for the release of these inmates. Look, a correctional system has to have an element of rehabilitation. It absolutely, absolutely does. But this gets really messy and weird. Gavin Newsom, our current governor here in California, his father was a judge, a retired judge at that time. And he came forward along with other celebrities to advocate for these guys. And I remember working with an inmate one time who was referred to me in prison, and he wasn't in the mental health system. And there was a reason that he was referred to me by the staff. He was a lifer because of a home invasion robbery. And he admitted he pistol whipped a guy. They terrorized the guy's family within their home. What was the driver of it? It was all drugs. Now, I'm not saying that he's not responsible for it. I'm saying that he was a hardcore drug addict. He has insight into it. And the guy would sit there and talk about, how did I do that to those people? What must they feel? Does that man wake up every morning reliving what I did to him? Now, is there the chance that I was being manipulated as a person who's working in a prison? There's always that possibility. Sure. However, this was a pretty heartfelt story that we processed over a period of months. I don't see any of that happening here at all. Like, this wasn't a drug driven, this was purely money driven, shoving weapons in children's faces. Not just one victim, not two victims, not three victims. It's 26 victims.
Yeah.
That were terrorized during this event. So it is really kind of unbelievable that they got out after a case like this.
See, I think this is the point in the documentary that is very uncomfortable, because how long is long enough? And we start off the documentary with the parts that tug at our heartstrings, right? We're hearing about the crime. We're hearing how this has been absolutely carried by these victims and survivors for decades. But on the flip side of it, and I'm not downplaying what happened, because like I've already said, I can't imagine something more horrific.
No, and we're having a conversation. And I'm expressing what my emotions are saying.
Totally.
So that is my emotional response that can be quite divorced from exactly what you're saying, which is an intellectual understanding of what a Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is supposed to do. I get it.
Yeah. And I'm saying, like, these are exactly like what the viewers are probably wrestling with, and some maybe not, some on very extreme ends of both. But do we keep people who have done something like this in forever? And then how does that get measured against cases where there is bodily harm or where there is death caused, right? Because on paper, there wasn't. But I mean, some may argue that this lifelong psychological trauma is worse than bodily injury. And I totally get that. I think there's an argument for that. So I just want to make a point. Like, this is probably the uncomfy part of this documentary is like, should these men be paroled for this dumbassery crime that they tried to pull off, but then resulted in so much long-term trauma? It's a hard formula to look at.
Absolutely. So some good news about this is that the surviving victims were able to settle a lawsuit against their kidnappers in 2016, and they did receive some compensation from Woods's trust fund, which is actually way more of an accomplishment than you would think. It is very, very hard for victims to actually get access to funds after that amount of time. Yeah, you really have to have a system that works in your favor to make it happen.
But holy shit, like decades later, they're finally settling a lawsuit. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, this is a story about post-traumatic growth as well. And especially when we kind of hear each person's story of their journey of healing, but also as a field, as an industry, we get the long-term psychological impact on the victims that was done through the Chowchilla study. That is really an advancement in treatment for young victims. And they talk in the documentary, if it wasn't for us, the Chowchilla kids, they might not know to have counselors at Columbine or, a lot of these mass trauma events with kids now. So I think, it certainly, it took a horrible thing to make a contribution to the field. And hopefully we're doing somewhat better with our kids now.
So media coverage, cultural impact, there's a lot. That kidnapping inspired a number of media adaptations, including a song by Robert Goulet, of all people. I know, made for television movie and episodes in TV series, focusing on true crime. There's a Law and Order version of, mass kidnapping as well. As far as ratings, I'm going to give it top notch. I think it was really well done. I was not expecting to, I don't want to say enjoy it, but I was not expecting to appreciate it to the extent that it did. I think it hits on something so important, which is that trauma and recovery. And I would say my only criticism is that I would have liked more of the psychiatrist and more of the treatment team if they could fit that in. But it is lengthy. It's a solid, dense, hour and a half. It takes it's not something you can half-assed watch. You really have to pay attention.
True. So you giving it 5 brains?
Are we on 5 brains? Yeah, I'm going to give it 5 brains. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to give it a 4. I think it's a very, very good documentary. Not only is it a story that needs to be told, it was an incredibly high profile incident that needs to be revisited. And the timing feels perfect. These survivors that chose to participate are at a good place in their lives. And it feels like they're doing this of their own volition because they believe in the story needing to be out there, as well as us as consumers learning from what went wrong, what can we do better, again, in service of trauma survivors everywhere. And it just, as we said, just kind of the production, the way the story's told worked. It all worked together. So I think the director of this, sorry I didn't put his name in here this time, but he hasn't done a documentary before. He's done a lot of actually he's known as being a writer, not a director, and he's worked on some really good projects, but kudos. So
yeah, absolutely.
Good job. But yeah, another one in the books. Thanks guys for the recommendation. We had a few people watch this at the beginning of the month and suggest it. So thanks, and keep those coming.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll have more announcements coming up on changes soon. All interesting stuff, all good stuff. And keep the suggestions coming. And we will see you next time on LA
Not So
Confidential.
Thanks,
bye, folks.
Guys. Bye. We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of the Crawl Space Media Network in partnership with Glassbox Media. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
The LA Not So Confidential theme, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons attribution license, and you can check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Instagram at LA Not So Podcast, on Twitter at LA Not So Pod, and on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Please join us each month on Saturdays at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for a live streaming and very interactive broadcast on YouTube entitled Behind the Couch. Stay tuned to all of our social media for our live streaming scheduling announcements.
Subscribe to LA Not So Confidential so you never miss a new episode. And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, and you'll be the first notified about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool swag coming your way.
Thanks for listening, and join in with us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Bye, folks.